Since my dad worked at a camp during the summer as I was growing up, I had some unique opportunities to enjoy at that camp. Different things that are not easy to enjoy or not the same in the backyard. So one thing that we enjoyed at this camp was a very big pool. I'd go there and swim right after lunch. Couldn't understand why I got a stomach ache, but I'd do it anyway. Swim and swim and swim. And then eventually in that chlorine-saturated pool, your eyesight starts to get hazy, and still swim anyways until Mom finally said it was time to go. We also had a lake there. The lake had different water. If you were to take a glass and fill it with the water from the pool, set it down, and then take a glass and fill it with water from the lake and set it down, you would see two different types of water. Now, we could go in the lake, we could swim in the lake, but in about half of the lake you could even touch on the bottom, but you never quite knew what to expect when you touched on the bottom. Sometimes you would just have sand. Other times your feet would continue sinking. It would be squishy, slimy, disgusting stuff, plant life. And so if you set that glass of lake water down, it would be discolored. You'd have floaties in it. And eventually, if you left it there long enough, some of that would settle on the bottom. You'd have sediment in the water, and maybe it'd be a little bit clearer, but it'd still be very different water. Think of Job's life as that second cup of water, the one holding the lake water. And as his life progressed over time and he had habits of worship and dealing with sin, well, the sediment settles to the bottom and it looks fairly clear. He was a man who was blameless and upright, who feared God and turned from evil. He sought to deal with sin rightly, but he wasn't perfect. Along comes Elihu, this young buck. He'd been silent as long as he could. And finally, what he was seeing in front of him, he couldn't hold it in any longer. And it's as if he's picking up that glass of lake water, representing Job's life, and he puts his hand over the top, shakes it up, and holds it in Job's face. And he says, look, you have some things to deal with. Now, maybe his tact was not necessarily there, but there's truth in his words. And so in his first speech, he was careful and he was humble to try to explain why the other men should listen to him. But as his speeches progress, as we look at his second and his third speech today, we're going to see him growing in boldness. There's truth that Job needs to hear. See, Job's life had been shaken up. Suffering had entered into his world, suffering which none of us have quite experienced that extent of before. And so in some ways he doesn't know up from down. And as he progresses through that suffering, which was not a result of his sin, he handles it imperfectly because we're imperfect people. And by and large, he was faithful to God. He continued addressing his words to God, whereas his other friends did not. And he was clinging to God in so many ways. There were some things that started coming out. His words started showing that there were elements of his faith that were not quite right. See, sin had not brought his suffering, but as he was experiencing suffering, he experienced it, at least in part, sinfully. And so Elihu is trying to help him see that there are some things that he needs to think very carefully about before God. His life had been disturbed, and that murkiness, that sediment that had settled to the bottom, as that comes more into the light, Job has some things to repent of. He has some things to turn from. He's questioned God's justice, and that was wrong. He's questioned how God has ruled in his life. And so as we look at Job 34 and 35 this morning, I think we'll see this challenge. God does not call us to question life as he designs it, but to trust his way of ruling over life. God does not call us to question life as he designs it, but to trust his way of ruling over life. And as we go, I hope we can see a couple different ways that trusting God looks like. What does trusting God in the midst of a tumultuous life, of a suffering life, what does it look like? Elihu's second speech, found in Job 34, is basically a call for Job to confess, acknowledging that he is guilty before God, who reigns in justice. And then his third speech in chapter 35 shows him confronting Job for his pride in how he has dealt with the trouble in his life. And both of those speeches, I think, lead us back to that challenge that God doesn't call us to question life as he designs it, but to trust his way of ruling over life. So as we begin, please listen as I read Job chapter 34. Then Elihu answered and said, "Hear my words, you wise men, and give ear to me, you who know. For the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose what is right. Let us know among ourselves what is good. For Job has said, I am in the right, and God has taken away my right. In spite of my right, I am counted a liar. My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. What man is like Job, who drinks up scoffing like water, who travels in company with evildoers and walks with wicked men? For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should take delight in God. Therefore, hear me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. For according to the work of a man, he will repay him, and according to his ways he will make it befall him. Of a truth, God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. Who gave him charge over the earth, and who laid on him the whole world? If he should set his heart to it, and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. If you have understanding, hear this, listen to what I say. Shall one who hates justice govern? Will you condemn him who is righteous and mighty, who says to a king, worthless one, and to nobles, wicked men, who shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work of his hands? In a moment they die. At midnight the people are shaken and pass away, and the mighty are taken away by no human hand. For his eyes are on the ways of a man, he sees all his steps. There is no gloom or deep darkness where evildoers may hide themselves, for God has no need to consider a man further that he should go before God in judgment. He shatters the mighty without investigation and sets others in their place. Thus, knowing their works, he overturns them in the night and they are crushed. He strikes them for their wickedness in a place for all to see. Because they turned aside from following him and had no regard for any of his ways, so that they caused the cry of the poor to come to him, and he heard the cry of the afflicted. When he is quiet, who can condemn? When he hides his face, who can behold him, whether it be a nation or a man? That a godless man should not reign, that he should not ensnare the people. For has anyone said to God, I have borne punishment, I will not offend any more. Teach me what I do not see. If I have done iniquity, I will do it no more. Will he then make repayment to suit you because you reject it? For you must choose and not I. Therefore declare what you know. Men of understanding will say to me, and the wise man who hears will say, Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without insight. Would that Job were tried to the end, because he answers like wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. I'm going to divide this chapter into three different parts. And the first part is verses 1 through 15, where we see Job is wrong to accuse God of perverting justice. This is really an address to you wise men. You see in verse 2, hear my words, you wise men. This could be the other three friends of Job that we've already seen in the book, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. But Elihu didn't seem to have an incredibly high view of these men, so maybe he's just speaking to wise men in general. But he says, hear my words. In verse 4, he says, let us choose what is right. So there are others that he is including in some way. And then in verse 5, for Job has said. Now, what was it that Job had said? Twice here he's going to refer to Job's words, verses 5 and 6, and then in verse 9. So he's kind of quoting Job in verses 5 and 6 as claiming he's in the right and that God has taken away his right. So he's accusing God of not being just, of not giving him a hearing. And then that reminds you, it's been a little while since we were in chapter 27, but maybe that reminds you of the first few verses in 27 where he says, as God lives, these are Job's words, as God lives who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood and my tongue will not utter deceit. So he has claimed in the past that it is God who has made his soul bitter, and yet he is innocent. Eliphaz can't let that rest. He has a problem with that. All along the way, Job has claimed to be innocent, meaning that his suffering was not retribution from God for a wicked life. And to that, the book agrees. So Job did not earn this suffering because of wickedness. But has he been innocent since that suffering began? Has he been innocent in his words since that point? We've seen Job say some very hard things to swallow. I mean, we hear him say things, we go, I would never say that to God, or I hope I never would. Things like what he has accused God of in chapter 27. And so as Elihu is hearing this, he compares Job to scoffers and wicked men. You see in verse, down just a little bit, in verse 7, what man is like Job who drinks up scoffing like water? It's a picture of Job gulping down scoffing like a thirsty man would gulp down water. Now, Eliphaz had said something similar of Job back in chapter 15, verse 16. He said that Job was a man who drinks injustice like water. So is Elihu being too harsh on Job here, just as his other friends were harsh? I think there's this key difference. Job's other friends said, look, Job, you are suffering terribly. You must have been wicked. You must have been a scoffer in the past. So they're assuming past actions. Here's the difference with Elihu. He's saying, Job, I've listened to your words. And as you've been speaking, you've said some things that sound awfully lot like what wicked men would say. See the difference? So he's evaluating Job's words since his suffering began. The other friends are looking at Job's life, which is just terribly fallen apart, and said, nobody's life falls apart like that unless they're wicked. So there is a key difference. However, let's consider some of Job's words from the past. So Job said in chapter 9, verse 22, speaking of God, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. In other words, there's no distinction to what God does. He just takes out both sides. If you're blameless, you might get killed. If you're wicked, you might get killed. What is that doing? Well, that's touching on the justice of God. Is God really just if he just blindly destroys both the blameless and the wicked? In Job 10, verses 2 and 3, Job says, I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands and favor the designs of the wicked? Again, he's going too far here. He's calling into question the justice of God, that God would favor the wicked over the righteous. Then, I'm not going to read this whole section, but Job 21, verses 7 to 16, Job questions why the wicked enjoy long life, power, and prosperity. So was Elihu correct to ask Job in verses 7 and 8, or to ask the other men, I should say, in verses 7 and 8, what man is like Job, who drinks up scoffing like water, who travels in company with evildoers and walks with wicked men? I think so. See, over time, the combination of Job's words were painting a picture, and part of that picture was not good. He was saying things repeatedly against the justice of God, calling it into question. And Elihu is perceptive enough to pull out some of this and to recognize that Job is claiming to be in the right, and he's claiming that God is in the wrong. But what is the attitude that he's doing this with? Some have accused Elihu of just standing there and brashly throwing things in Job's face, arrogantly. See, when you read the text, sometimes it's hard to understand the attitude or the spirit in which it's given. I'd like to give Elihu a bit of, not a bit of a break per se, but maybe try to understand his words in a positive light. See, back in Job chapter 2, Job's wife had said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." And Job's response at that time had been this: "You speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. See, Job's wife wanted him to curse God so that just his suffering would end. And when we looked at Job's words there, we could look at him saying, "You're foolish woman, get out of my way." But that's not how we understood that. Instead, I think he was careful. You're speaking as if you were a foolish woman. You're not a foolish woman. I know that's not who you are. So be careful. What your words are resembling now is the words of a foolish one. You don't want to be foolish. Don't speak like this. I think that's how we should understand Elihu's words here. Job, your words are showing that you're just taking all of this scoffing. Your words are showing that you're traveling in company with evildoers and walking with the wicked men. This is not good. Then on to verses 10 through 15. Here, Elihu calls again on the men of understanding to hear his main point. "Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong." This is the negative way of saying this main truth. The positive way is found in verse 11. "For according to the work of man, he will repay him, and according to his ways, he will make it befall him." This sounds a lot like the message of Job's other friends again, but the problem with his friends was mainly in their application of this teaching. Like I said, they looked at the result, Job's suffering, and they worked backwards to conclude he must have been a wicked man. But the truth is that God is a just judge. In the end, he will reward every person according to that individual's life. But a person's present condition in this life does not automatically show whether that person is righteous or wicked. We can't say they've had a terrible 3 months financially. The 3 months before that must have been them living wickedly. We can't make that kind of conclusion. That's not how God's justice works. Now, is it possible that somebody makes very poor choices financially and then has to suffer the consequences of that? Absolutely. But when God is looking to bring his judgment to an individual, he does it in his own time and in his own way. He works on a much bigger timetable to establish his justice. Other passages of wisdom literature in the Old Testament show the same thing of what Elihu's talking here. So Proverbs 12:14, "From the fruit of his mouth a man is satisfied with good, and the work of a man's hands will come back to him." Or Proverbs 19:17, "Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed." We can know with certainty that God will not act wickedly or pervert justice. No one passed on to him his charge over all the earth. That is his right to rule over the earth because he is the creator. Just as he breathed into man the breath of life so that Adam became a living soul, he could, if he so desired, pull back that breath and take life from all mankind. He's that powerful, and he has the right to do with our lives as he pleases. You see some hints of that in the end of that section. If he should set his heart to it and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. We believe that God sustains all of life. And if he chooses to pull that life from an individual, that is his right to do as creator. And so notice how Elihu is bringing up Job's words. He's stating what Job has said in the past, and now he's going back to the character of God. Something's wrong, Job. You are bringing into question God's justice, but we know that God's justice is absolute. His power is there. And so you see, starting at verse 16 down through verse 33, Job confessed before God, who rules in absolute, perfect justice. He calls Job to confess. And this is where the transition happens in his speech, where instead of speaking to the wise men of understanding, he's now speaking to Job. So it's singular in verse 16. If you, singular, pointed at Job, have understanding, hear this. He's going to elaborate on what he said, speaking to Job himself. He stated the doctrine of God regarding justice and power or authority in verses 11 to 15, and now really he was showing there how they can't be separated. A ruler cannot reward you appropriately unless that ruler has the power to do so. A ruler cannot punish appropriately unless the ruler has the power to do so. So power and justice go together. Why would we fear authority if that authority cannot keep us in line? They go together. Well, Job still believes in the power of God. In fact, he's continued addressing God as really the supreme one in all of this. But it's the justice of God that he's wavered on. As Elihu continues, he claims, rightly so, that God cannot be all-powerful while not being perfectly just. This is behind his question in verse 17. Shall one who hates justice govern? God being who he is, it's simply not possible for him to be all-powerful without being perfectly just. You can't divide him like that. So Job's view of God is wrong. It's inconsistent. Kings and nobles, as the text goes on, verse 18, kings and nobles do not intimidate or sway God. He shows no partiality in governing, whether a person is powerful, rich, or poor. Isn't it a huge deal today regarding justice? About the ability of those in authority to be swayed by different factors? It's a huge deal in our society. With God, he does not show partiality. He holds the very powers of life and death for every person. To take an individual's life, God needs no assistance. He can do it completely on his own. The mighty are taken away by no human hand. God's knowledge of every person's life is complete in verse 21. His eyes are on the ways of a man, and he sees all his steps. Nothing we can do can hide us from God. When it comes to our evaluation before God, there's no process of judgment that God needs to conduct. He fully knows everything about everyone. He doesn't need his own FBI or CIA. He doesn't need private detectives or lawyers or judges. He doesn't need a windshield cam or a body cam. He has no need for a time clock for his people, for fingerprints, or for GPS. He doesn't need to have a storage on a hard drive or on a vast server network. He has no use for instant replays or coach's challenge. He knows everything at once about everyone. Weather doesn't deter him. No cave can hide us from his presence. He needs no counselors. And in every single situation, he knows the perfectly just response to the thoughts, words, and actions of every single person who has ever lived, is currently living, or will live. This is our God. He's all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly just. Job needed a wake-up call. He needed to go back to that truth. God hears the cry of the poor and the afflicted as he goes on. And when he decides to bring judgment upon the wicked or the mighty, he can remove them in an instant. Yet with all of this, verse 29 bears an important and necessary message for Job specifically. God has been quiet. And Job has wondered why. Well, Elihu says in verse 29, when he is quiet, who can condemn? When he hides his face, who can behold him, whether it be a nation or a man? Job has, in his own eyes, become the victim. God has become the aggressor. He has spoken of God attacking him brutally, and he has accused God of taking away his right by not answering his pleas. God has been silent, and Job has accused him for that silence. Is Job the only one who has wanted more explanation from God throughout human history? Not at all. Sometimes when God's people have wanted answers from him, he's been silent. If you read the Psalms much, and I'd encourage us all to read the Psalms often, you'll find that one of the common themes is calling upon God to give justice to the enemies of God's people. We crave justice. So if you have a hard time waiting for God to bring justice to the wicked, you're not alone. This is and has been a difficult issue for many. Even in the future, God's people will plead for God to bring justice. So Revelation 6, verses 9 through 11, speaking of a judgment during the yet to come time of tribulation that God will bring on the earth, says this, Revelation 6, 9 to 11. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So in a time yet to come, there will be this mass of those who were faithful unto death with God, and their plea will be, how long before you bring justice? How long before you judge and avenge our blood? God's people have longed for God's justice. God brings it in his own time and in his own way. There's times when we want him to bring swift justice. And yet we must trust that God operates in his own time and in his own way. Although the question of verses 31 and 32 might seem general, has anyone said to God, I have borne my punishment? It goes into that confession. Really the call is towards Job. Elihu is calling on Job to confess his sin before God. And like I said, his other three friends also thought Job needed to humble himself before God. They also thought that he needed to confess, but they claimed it was because of a wicked lifestyle that they could not prove. Elihu's different because he's calling on Job to confess for what he has said. He's accused God of not being just. Job needs to change his attitude before God. He needs to accept what God has brought, saying that he will not offend anymore and being willing to be taught so that he will not continue sinning. It's a huge indication that something is not right is if somebody is not teachable. Teach me what I do not see. Maybe I'm missing something in this. Help me understand the big picture. In the end, though, the choice of confessing his sin or keeping his charge against God is Job's choice to make, and nobody else's. Verse 33, you must choose, and not I. So Elihu understood this was something that Job needed to decide on. Confession before God for personal sin is a personal matter. I can't confess for something you specifically have done. You can't confess for something that I have done. Then we get to verse 34, down to verse 37. Here's the judgment of the wise. Although Elihu seems to give Job a chance to speak after verse 34, Job is quiet. So Elihu says, therefore declare what you know. Ever been in a conversation where you're just waiting for that person to take a breath so that you can actually respond? Well, maybe this was the breath that Elihu finally took. But Job remains quiet, and so Elihu continues speaking. He's confident that other wise men will agree with him in condemning Job's words as being without knowledge and insight. And then verse 36 is actually a curse. Would that Job were tried to the end. This is another debated part of Elihu's speech, but I think Elihu is genuinely wanting God to establish justice here and to try Job to the end so that he will see that he is answering like wicked men. Questioning God's justice is no small matter. When a person speaks words against God, that person is accountable for such words of rebellion. Job is, in fact, pushing back against God's rule in his life, and this rebellion must end. See here that here's a man, God's servant, who's been faithful in so many ways. But in some ways he needs to change. I think it's another reminder that sin is a serious deal. It's a big deal. You don't get bonus points for doing most of the things right so that God overlooks other sin that you've done. No, he is perfectly just. He hates sin. And that brings us to chapter 35, Elihu's third speech. This is shorter, just 16 verses. Please listen as I read this. And Elihu answered and said, "Do you think this to be just? Do you say it is my right before God? That you ask, what advantage have I? How am I better off than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man. Because of the multitude of oppressions, people cry out. They call for help because of the arm of the mighty. But none says, where is God my Maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth, and makes us wiser than the birds of the heavens? There they cry out, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. Surely God does not hear an empty cry, nor does the Almighty regard it. How much less when you say that you do not see him, that the case is before him, and you are waiting for him. And now, because his anger does not punish, and he does not take much note of transgression, Job opens his mouth in empty talk. He multiplies words without knowledge. Verses 1 through 4, we see a similar pattern to chapter 34. Elihu is going to basically formulate, put together, and repeat what Job has said. So, Job, you question whether right living makes any difference. After presenting a strong case for God's just and powerful rule, Elihu now turns the tables on Job and asks Job himself if he has acted in a just way. You claim God has not been just, but have you yourself been just? A very perceptive question. Do you think, verse 2, do you think this to be just? You say, I'm in the right. Or I think what we have here in the ESV, do you say it is my right before God? Some of you might have the NIV translation. I think that gives a little bit of a better kind of a sense of what Job is saying. It says in the later part of verse 2, instead of it is my right before God, the NIV says, I am in the right, not God. It's basically a claim that Job himself is right, and by implication, God is not. Surely this can't be the case, since Job himself is questioning. Job can't be just, because if he's saying that he is right and not God, and if he is saying things like in verse 3, how am I better off than if I had sinned? Then Job is not right in what he is doing. He's basically showing pragmatic thinking. What advantage do I have? How am I better off than if I had sinned? Look, I tried to be right in my suffering. I tried to do right. And look, it's just continued. Nothing has changed, and God is silent. And so Job is questioned, what's the point? Why hold fast to my integrity? Such pragmatic thinking is dangerous. Thinking that looks not at the rightness of an action, but at the benefit of an action. And that is not justice. Job is dangerously close to showing that at this point, he's ready to fear God if it benefits him. And since it does not seem to benefit him, what's the point of fearing God? And what does this sound like? It sounds like what Satan asked himself back in Job 1, verse 9. Does Job fear God for no reason? It's as if Job is toying with the thought, why do I fear God if life looks like this? And again, to quote Job 9:22, I've already mentioned it this morning, where Job says, God destroys both the blameless and the wicked. These thoughts, this sediment has been in Job's life for a while. It was sitting at the bottom of the cup. It's been shaken up, and his wrong view of God in some particular ways is starting to come through. Why live rightly if life is terrible and it just continues being terrible, even if I try to do the right things? Elihu sees that as dangerous, and he's trying to warn Job now. And so he says in verses 5 through 8, Job, you presume too much. You're going too far. Now, Psalm 8, verses 3 and 4 say, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Sometimes, and maybe more often than we'd like to admit, we forget how great God is, how much greater he is than us. Do you remember as a kid ever doing this, where you'd lay down on the grass on a nice summer day and you'd look up at the sky and you see the clouds going by, and maybe you try to figure out what shapes they are and all that stuff. But it doesn't take very long when you're doing something like that to realize how small you are. In fact, when I'm doing that, sometimes I wonder, why am I staying on the earth instead of just floating up into the... Maybe I'm just weird that way, but when you do things like this, or you go to the Grand Canyon, or you stand at the base of a mountain, do different things within God's creation, it doesn't take long for God to remind us through those activities how small we are. Well, that's what Elihu brings to bear here. Look at the heavens and see. And behold the clouds, which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? You're this little man, Job, on the earth. God is this great and mighty God. Your sin does not harm him. Your rebellion does not endanger his plans. But if we turn the tables, verse 7, if you are righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Even if you're good, Job, you don't earn anything from God. You don't earn those bonus points. Your wickedness, though, verse 8, your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness the son of man. It does affect you. So you're this little person, Job, on this big world that is ruled by this great God. Any sin that you're contemplating, it's not going to endanger God. It might hurt you. Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself. Your righteousness, the son of man. It might help you if you live in righteousness, but don't overestimate your importance, Job. You're presuming too much. He wants Job to grasp that God is high above him. And the implication here is that Job cannot force God's hand. He cannot force a reaction from God. Sinning frequently doesn't harm him. Living a righteous life doesn't put God in anyone's debt. And this leads to the second moral truth that Elihu wants Job to grasp. Job's behavior does affect himself. And so pragmatic thinking will have bad consequences. Now, whatever you think here with his confrontation of Job, whether it's bold confrontation or soft and nice confrontation, it definitely gets more severe as we go on. So verses 9 through 16, God is not compelled to answer the proud. Many have cried out to God in the past, but found no help. Why? Many have prayed to God in the past and had no help from him. Verse 9, because of the multitude of oppressions, people cry out. They call for help because of the arm of the mighty. Many people have cried out to God. But Elihu says, none says, where is God, my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth, and makes us wiser than the birds of the heavens? In other words, many people cry out because life is bad. They're not crying out, though, from a heart of faith. Where is God, my maker, who gives songs in the night? Psalm 42:8 says, by day the Lord commands his steadfast love. At night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. Instead of such a prayer, they approach God in pride, and he does not answer. Verse 12, there they cry out, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. Is it possible to pray to God in pride? Absolutely. Is it possible to pray to God in such a way that it's accusatory? Yes. And so people get in a tough spot, and life is unraveling and looks terrible, and nobody wants to stay in that kind of moment. And people look to God and say, come on. And God sees that pride, and he turns from it. But instead, what should it look like? It should look like Psalm 42:8. At night, his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. Where does Job's prayer fall? Verse 13, surely God does not hear an empty cry, nor does the Almighty regard it. How much less, Job, when you say that you do not see him, that the case is before him and you are waiting for him. What is he saying to Job? Your cry to God is a cry of a prideful man. There's the confrontation. And this is kind of shocking to us. Here's God's servant who's been faithful in so many ways, and here he's being rebuked. But I think the point sticks. There's been pride in Job's heart. He's expected things from God that he has no right to expect. He's been accusatory against his Maker. Has Job spoken much of night or darkness in the book? Remember that theme? Going back and forth from light to darkness. His world has been dark. Have we seen much evidence of Job turning to God in that darkness and making God his song? We've not. Have we seen much evidence of him saying things like, at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life? We haven't. Dark nights will come. Maybe you're in a dark period of life right now. Those dark times inevitably come when we say, I don't feel very close to God. It doesn't seem like he's hearing my prayers. One thing after another goes wrong, and we're at some decisions. Do we interpret those things as things we don't deserve and look to God with accusation in our eyes, saying, come on, another thing? Evidence of a proud heart. Or do we look to God in darkness, not being able to see, not knowing the next step of life, fearing that it might be a step of which there's no ground underneath? And in that darkness, where we cannot see our hand in front of our face, we don't need the light, because God has given faith. And in faith we express, yes, God, it's night. Life is heavy and burdensome. Things do not seem right. But you are my God, and to you I cling. Give me the songs that help me to endure this time of darkness. Say, I think Elihu was right. There was pride that had seeped into Job's life. And so as God was silent, he just kept on talking. Job opens his mouth in empty talk. He multiplies words without knowledge. Sometimes it's right to stop talking and to start waiting upon our God, whom we know is loving, whom we know is all-powerful, whom we know knows everything and has a plan and is actively accomplishing that plan. We don't see any of it. We only see darkness around us. And it's at those very moments that God has called upon his people to be people of faith, who make his truth their song in the night. One thing that emboldens me to see Elihu's words as right here is that just a little while later, Job 38:2, God says this, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? There is God's ruling on the matter. In some things, Job has not helped. So as I said, it's shocking to spend so much time appreciating Job's faith in God, how he's clung to God through much of the book, only to come here at the end and see Elihu so boldly confront him. Pride is incredibly dangerous. One of the most dangerous things about it is that when we're in our pride, we often don't think that we're acting like that. We don't think that we've become proud. Elihu, the youngest in the group, though, is forceful and confrontational, and Job needs to receive his rebuke. If he does so, it will prepare him more for the rebuke that God will give in just a little while. So my question to you is, could it be that your dark night of the soul is so dark? Could it be that your dark night of the soul is so dark because your prayers resemble more those of Job and the wicked? Is there accusation in your eyes as you're looking up to God? Or are you seeking to make his truth the song of your soul in that darkness? God does not call us to question life as he designed it, but to trust his way of ruling over life. Let's pray. God, one of the